Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this very, very special session in today's discussion of the Hubert Humphrey centennial birthday. We have a terrific panel this afternoon, all very distinguished office holders who have contributed greatly to the history and culture and politics of the state of Minnesota. The subject for this afternoon is civility in 21st century politics, and I think it's going to be an interesting and lively discussion. Certainly, civility is one of the hallmarks of Hubert Humphrey's career, and we'd like to reflect on that issue going forward. One of the lines that Hubert gave on more than one occasion was that you can always debate about what you should have done. The question is, what are we going to do now? And I think that's a good issue to think about as we consider civility. There's a lot that we can complain about currently in the lack of civility in politics, but repeating Humphrey's phrase, which is, what are we going to do about it, as opposed to complain. So we'd like to, as part of our discussion this afternoon, look forward to the next 5 or 10 years to anticipate the challenges that are with us, to consider new strategies and approaches to some of the unresolved issues that were championed by Hubert Humphrey, issues that we still face today. So our panel members are going to start by offering their personal experiences and reflections about these policies and about their involvement with Hubert Humphrey. Let me introduce all of the panelists, and then we'll ask each of them to speak for a few minutes and talk about some of these issues as we begin. To my left, to your right here, is former Vice President Walter Mondale. He needs, of course, no introduction. He is Minnesota's first citizen in many respects, a distinguished career as Minnesota Attorney General, as United States Senator, as Vice President of the United States, as a candidate for President of the United States, and as Ambassador to Japan. He is someone who has participated in many of the important debates in the state over the past 50 years, and we're very glad to have him with us. To my right is Governor Arne Carlson, an outstanding public servant as well, who served 2 terms as governor of the state of Minnesota in the 1990s, when we didn't have many of these budget balancing problems that we have today. We had people who worked together to solve these problems, much in the way that Hubert Humphrey championed. Governor Carlson served from 1990 through 1999. As you all know, previous to that, he served as the state auditor of Minnesota, where he served with great distinction as well. He has retired as chair of the RiverSource Columbia Funds Board, but he continues as vice president or vice chair of the Rideau Recognition Board and as secretary of the University of Minnesota Medical School Board of Advisors. And he writes a regular political blog that is very interesting and enlightening, and I hope you'll check it from time to time. And to Governor Carlson's right is former State Attorney General Skip Humphrey, the son of Hubert Humphrey, a man that I had a chance to work with in the Attorney General's office for years. It was a great pleasure for me to work with Skip every day. A distinguished public servant. He served 4 terms as Attorney General. And he's active in many different organizations today, including the National Board of the AARP and many other boards. His terms as Attorney General were very distinguished. He ran unsuccessfully for governor in 1998, but he's had a long career which includes service in the Minnesota State Senate. So, Vice President Mondale, can we begin with you?
Thank you. We are very grateful to you for chairing this discussion this afternoon, and we're very proud of your record in public life and your career on the federal bench. It's nice to be with Skip again. Skip is, by almost everyone's appraisal, the second best Attorney General in Minnesota's history. It's a joy to be with you. So, yeah. And we'll discount Warren Spanis here. And a word about Arne Carlson. This discussion is about civility and compromise. And I would submit Arne Carlson as Exhibit A as to what this means. Arne's had a long, vigorous public life. He's been the governor of this state. He's been a strong advocate for what he believes in. Civility does not involve parking your beliefs somewhere and just making a sloppy compromise. And certainly no one's ever accused Arne of doing that. But he has also been a day-to-day courageous leader who's willing to stand up in the middle of controversy and try to shape an answer that may ride over politics or not ride over politics. And I almost every day when I see Arne, I'm really grateful to what you're doing for all of us at what I think is a particularly difficult time as we try to seek common ground and common good. And Arne, I salute you. I'll just make this one point about commitment and compromise. I think compromise without commitment can be a sticky and counterproductive idea. But if you believe in something deeply, as for example, Humphrey believed in civil rights, he had to do a lot of compromising to get from where we were. And in the first time in 280 years in American history, finally overwhelm this idea of really the shame of America, that you can officially discriminate. He got it done. He got it done in part because he would listen to and talk with and find ways of compromising with his opposition. He would reach out like he could play Everett Dirksen like a violin. And Everett was, of course, the chairman of the Republican caucus, but he'd get him to move and co-sponsor amendments, and then it wasn't Humphrey's amendment, it was Dirksen's amendment. And then he could pick up some of those old Republicans, and the first thing you knew, you had a majority. And Humphrey was always had the sense for that. And he made things possible that never would have been possible before.
Well, after those nice comments by the Vice President, I'm not sure I know what to say. We had a pre-caucus on whether or not we were for civility, and it passed by a 2-to-1 vote. But it truly is an honor. And I think we as Minnesotans kind of take it for granted that we've been blessed with such good political leadership for well over a century. Two outstanding men that went on to become vice presidents of the United States. And I can think of no one that represents the Minnesota tradition of service over self and intelligence and substance over partisan bickering. And that would be Walter Mondale. I'm deeply grateful for the friendships that we've developed. Thank you so much. And to Skip, I can honestly say it's an extraordinarily difficult position to grow up as the son of an extraordinarily able and well-known political figure. And I can't think of anyone who has handled that role better than Skip has. And I say that because for years we worked together. And even when there were moments of disagreement, which occasionally do occur between a governor and an attorney general, it was always handled with a sense of respect, a sense of decency. And these men have helped define, along with the good senator, that's what Senator Humphrey was always called, the good senator, the good senator, what are the parameters of American politics? And those parameters are the parameters that define for us what decency is. And you just don't go outside the boundaries of decency. That's not to suggest it hasn't happened. It has. But it is to suggest that we know those lines exist. You do not question people's patriotism. You don't question their motives. You stay to the issues, if you will, of public policy. You understand that a more conservative person is going to look at the same set of facts differently than a liberal mind will address those facts. And some of the greatest debates that we've had through history have been when intelligent conservatives and intelligent liberals square off. For a brief time, I was on the good senator's staff for a brief time in Washington, but mostly in Wisconsin. But I remember one night in Washington, all of Washington was going to pile into the Senate galleries and hear this great debate between Wayne Morse of Oregon, and it was on, I think, an issue of disarmament or mutual security. Now, that was a boring topic, but it made no difference. The idea of Humphrey versus Morse, that is Major League Ball will show up. And they packed the galleries for that debate, absolutely packed it. Nowadays, it's sit down, be quiet, pass the bill, the flow of moneyed interests, etc. Now we have in the state legislature is something that bothers me enormously, and that is the brazen attitude of the chairman of the Republican Party bringing legislators in and, if you will, persuading them of the virtues of no compromise. What bothers me about that kind of a position is you cannot govern in a democratic society if you're not willing to give and take. There is no governance. Now, I realize I got a bit of a partisan audience here. But my point is simply this. All these jobs, be it the governor, be it a member of the legislature, all of these people get tugged in different directions by different interests for different purposes. Their job is to broker the concerns, but much more importantly, it's to broker the concerns within the confines of what you and I understand the role of government to do. Government, in this particular instance, brokers between the concerns of those who have power and those who do not. That requires a sense of judiciousness, a sense of fairness, a sense of decency. The good senator usually came down on the side of those who lack power. But the system as a whole, be it Democrat, Republican, liberal, conservative, by and large, has been protective of things like growing the middle class, making sure that there's opportunities for those who lack opportunity. Those are the normal struggles that will take place in a democratic society. And what we see here is increasingly the influence of money coming into politics to buy more power for those who have power at the expense of those who do not have power and do not have access to power. And nothing symbolizes that battle more than what's happening in Minnesota and nationally on the issue of health care. Over 80-some-odd thousand people will be off of Minnesota Care, which is a modest health program. They're a kind of program that we should be expanding year after year. That should be our discussion point, not how you whittle it back. But here they want to voucherize the system, but at the same time, when I ask that they place themselves in that same system, and they become the experimentees of that system and then report back to us in 2 years about how well the system worked and how they enjoy the high deductibles that they're willing to impose on poor people, then if it works for them, it stands to reason it's probably a pretty good program. But instead, we have, oh no, let me promulgate a goodie for you, but it's not sufficiently good for me. And that, to me, violates all concepts and all parameters of decency in public service. The only way we're going to change the lack of civility in our political discourse is frankly by winning elections. It's not going to happen by having forums like this. As much as this is an enjoyable experience, we are not going to change the world because we agree that lack of civility has no place in American politics. But the moment the lack of civility becomes a political detriment, that element of the Republican Party that has adopted it as its mantra will immediately drop it. And so it compels, in this case, the Democratic Party to realize that its best will not come out until such time as the Republicans can match them in talent. When the two political parties compete for ideas as they did in the Humphrey days, as they did in the Mondale days, as they did in the days of Skip Humphrey, if they can compete and have a collision of ideas, we, the public, win. But when one party questions the truthfulness, the patriotism, and the person carrying the message and demonizes the person over the message, and that works and becomes part of the stream of media, we, the public, lose. We lose big. And so if we want decency, we, the broad we, and I would ask you as Democrats to reach out to moderate Republicans, to all those of us who have been excommunicated, if you will, and to independents, and build a positive agenda that actually wins elections, and allow this minority to assume a smaller minority status in our society. And with that, I think we can bring back civility. During the process of this discussion, I'll be happy to put more meat on that proposal. But I do want us to start to think about, can we build a broad coalition, as Humphrey did with the Farmer Labor Group and the Democratic Group? Can we build an informal kind of a coalition that focuses on the constitutional amendments that are coming before the people, and build the bridges necessary to coalesce support from all disaffected wings, and make sure that the majority of Minnesotans and that their voices are truly felt. With that, I'll close, and we can open up later for discussion. Thank you.
Arne, I'm ready to go. Run. And I say that, I hope, in a very positive way. A very, very excellent review of what civility is all about. Mr. Vice President, your book and your life and the way in which you have handled international, national, local matters are the perfect example of civility, but action. Civility, but responsibility. And I think that's what we need to also think about. Now, what I'd like to do is this. I think I'm supposed to play a little bit of a role of the family. Let me just give you a couple of statements, quotes, and you can go right on the internet and find all sorts of them. But I want to put them in the context of what I think civility is about what my father had to say on a couple of things. One of the things he said is, to err is human, to blame someone else is politics. Now, you think about that in the context today. And I want you to put this all in the context also of the ability, the unbelievable technology that we have today to communicate. The idea of being, yes, we have a right to free speech, but we also have an obligation to use that right in a positive, constructive, civil way. So you just think about that, is what he said, and he tried to practice it, I know that. The other thing that he had to say was, the right to be heard does not automatically include the right to be taken seriously. And maybe some of those, 24/7 news shows ought to think about that a little bit. That, we don't need to hear everything all the time, forever, on all of it. What we need to hear is the important information so that we can have a conversation and a discussion and a thought process for ourselves as citizens. There's a real difference between decent political debate and just political noise. And I think as citizens, we need to educate ourselves as to how to make that discrimination in that. Dad also said this: freedom is hammered out on the anvil of discussion, dissent, and debate. He didn't shy away from it. It was part of his life. He loved it. One of the great stories that I heard when I first came in as Attorney General, Arne, was Justice Don Peterson was on the Supreme Court. And he pulled me over one time and he said, I got to tell you a story about your father. He said, you know, your father and I were on the University of Minnesota debate team. And he said, and we'd go around the Big Ten and we'd debate. And one time we were going down to Chicago to Northwestern. He said, if you thought that debate at Northwestern was good, you should have heard the one in the car. So, I mean, it was part and parcel of his life. And it should be part of our life in a constructive way, in a positive way, in a civil way, to engage in the points of view that we have so that we can struggle together to find the common ground to move forward on the common good. That's the easy part, is moaning and groaning and complaining and pointing fingers. The hard part is really seeking that sense of what are we going to do about solving the problem. And to me, that's the substance of civility, is to reach and to respect the differences of opinion and yet try and solve the problems that are in front of us. And finally, he said just a couple of other things here. He said, this then is the test that we must set for ourselves, not to march alone, but to march in such a way that others will wish to join us. Think about that for a moment. There are people out there today in politics that would be more than happy to stand up and wave the banner. Again, that's not so hard to do. But what's really challenging today is to be able to do it in a way that attracts a broad base of support so that we can engage in the tough job that Governor Carlson has talked about solving some of these human needs, particularly in healthcare and in those areas. So I see that as part of this whole question of civility. To me, there are just a couple of things. What is the sense of balance that civility demands? The sense of fairness, the respect for each other, to be able to look each other in the eye, have strong views. And I'll never forget, I had a chance to sit down with some of my colleague attorneys general with Mr. Goldwater, Senator Goldwater, before he passed on. And we used to have these sessions where everything was off the record, and we just asked folks, Senator Muskie and Senator Goldwater and all the rest, and asked him about what he thought about various individuals. And I'm not going to tell you what he said about Mr. Nixon or Mr. Johnson or whatever. But he got to my father and he said, oh, Hubert. He said, we never agreed on anything, but we were great friends.
That's right.
And I thought, isn't that wonderful? That you can have this robust point of view and at the same time enjoy a deep friendship and respect. How can we move forward in this technological age of the future with our democracy and achieve that? I'm not sure you can do it in 140 characters on tweet or Twitter or whatever it is. But, you know, I'd love to see my father try and give a speech in 140 characters. One final thing that I think Governor Carlson raised, it'd be about 700,000 tweets. He raised it very, very well, and I'll just put it point blank. Citizens United. A case that I am sure there are all sorts of different points of view. But the moment we decide that organizations, enterprises created in the legal structure have equal or even more rights than citizens, we have a problem. I heard my father once again talk about the preamble today, and it says, we the people. We need to make sure that we balance out. It is not to say that there aren't rights of free speech even to enterprises, But we must be careful to see that this money and the non-disclosure of where it's going and what it's going, we need to be able to be informed to make good decisions as citizens. And that's part of civility as well, knowing where things are happening and why they're happening.
Governor, I thought you made an especially good point here by saying that civility will be the norm if voters demand it, and voters punish those who act uncivilly in our political discourse. How do we get that message through to voters in a world that is so busy? People have so many things that they're doing, you know, if they're reading their Twitter accounts or they're running off to soccer matches or whatever. And also in a world where you have, you know, media that is specifically slanted to particular sides of the debate. So people are just watching what they want to watch. How do you get that message through so that voters do demand civility?
Well, I think of all the questions that could be asked, that's probably the most germane. You know, how do you do it? Skip used a good phrase, basically focusing on the utilization of the word we. There is no I in the word team, and I think we have to get back to that. Since we're a nation that's obsessed with sports, we may as well use some sport analogies. Let me suggest some things that we do have in common. Walter Mondale has worked very hard on congressional redistricting issues. How do you do it? How do you impanel impartial judges, et cetera, to make those decisions so that we have a system that fairly represents, quote, the people. And you don't have congressmen deciding who their constituents are. You have constituents deciding who their congresspeople are. Secondly, Al Quie has worked very hard on judicial selection. We in Minnesota have taken the quality of our judiciary for granted, largely because it has been successful, it has been independent, and it has reflected the very best interest of Minnesotans. But it clearly is under attack. And before it's too late, it would be well for us to visit the concerns that the former governor has raised and his team, and incorporate that as part of a consensus that represents, if you will, the broad we. I would argue the merits of ranked choice voting. Now, there's more disagreement on that issue than the other two, but nevertheless, it warrants its time before this committee as a possibility so that we can avoid what's been happening for the past 12 years with the Minnesota governor, and that is we don't have a governor that actually wins a majority of the vote. And so what ranked voting does is allow you to vote second choice, et cetera. The second thing that ranked voting does that appeals to me enormously, in order to be the ultimate winner, you can't afford to go to the extremes because getting the second vote is very important. And in order to get the second vote, you can't offend everybody who's going to support the number two. So you will find the parameters getting back inside what you and I would agree reflect decency. The third is the Coalition on Human Rights. I think if there's anything we can do to dedicate on this, the 100th birthday of the good senator, is that we commit ourselves to defeat that amendment that has now been brought forth relative to same-sex marriage. When you look at the history of any democratic society, it's a history, when it gets into the area of human rights, of those who have no power aspiring to be able to, at a minimum, participate. And any kind of activities that restrict that right to be recognized as a full citizen is offensive, I would argue, to the Constitution. And so I think defeating that amendment resoundingly would put the stamp of decency on the state of Minnesota. And likewise, on any kind of effort by the legislature to place any restrictions on voting that are designed to impair the right of all people to participate, particularly the elderly and students who tend to be more mobile. We may not like the outcome of every election. I think it's fair to say that all three of us had elections that we found extraordinarily distasteful.
You're right.
But we did understand that the people do have the right to disagree with us. And the idea that we can rig the voting booth is offensive to any concept of a free and open democratic society. There is a third one that I would raise that has not been discussed. And I think there's always the tendency not to discuss issues because you think you can slide under the radar. One of those has to do with the recent Supreme Court ruling that corporations can donate to candidates. Now, we can moan and groan as much as we want about that decision, but the fact of the matter is that it's law. It would be very wise for this body to form a small committee and say, okay, how can labor contributions reflect the democratic structure of that union? So when that union donates to candidate X, it reflects democratically the will of that union. That same standard should be applied to the corporation. And that means that every political donation that comes out of shareholder value goes through the board of directors. And that way the shareholder has a right to participate. It should not be left to the CEO to privately decide which way corporate money flows. Make it democratic for both sides. The final one is to better understand the role of our Constitution. The Constitution is not a place where we put our temporary peeves. It is not a place that we pass laws that we find, let's put it, affirmative, and the executive does not want them, so therefore we place it in the Constitution. That's a misuse of political power. The Constitution should rarely be amended. And if amended, it should usually revolve around some technical application that has occurred, unless there is some broad omission. There is nothing I have seen so far that warrants this kind of assault on the Minnesota Constitution. But I'll end, if I may, on this political note, and it's critical of the Democratic Party. I would argue that when one party significantly overreaches, it can only overreach with the permission of the other party. The other party has an obligation to fully participate to the fullest extent of its capacity. If there's anything that we can remember about Senator Hubert Humphrey, is not one single human being on this planet ever accused him of not participating in debate. Even when it was a topic upon which he was not sufficiently expert.
Boy, are you right on that.
And I won't digress, but there was a delightful debate over botany, and particularly as it affected the Capitol grounds, and little did the good senator know that Everett Dirksen was an expert botanist. It was a long, tough debate for the good senator. But suffice it to say, he taught us to participate. When a political party sits back, protects its own individual self-interest, the other party will overreach, as the Republican Party has. And it's up to the moderates, those of us who are moderate in the Republican Party, to fight back, and to fight back publicly. It's up to independents to fight. Because if we're going to have a two-party system, we want to make sure that both political parties are producing the best and the brightest. And it's up to the Democratic Party to fight. And I think in the last several weeks, we finally have seen some life on that side. That's good, and I hope it continues. But the way it can continue is by coalescing this kind of a group, bring together these kinds of leaders and say, okay, we will go out and campaign throughout all of Minnesota. We will define what we believe is in the best long-term interest of the people of this state, and at the same time defines our quality of life. And I think when we coalesce behind these kinds of issues, I think we, the public, win. And then both political parties are invigorated. If you go back to the hallmark years of Minnesota, it was the years when the Republican Party woke up and started to compete finally in the 60s and the 70s. And you look at those days, those were hallmark days. They truly were. It was a competition of ideas. I remember when we came in the legislature together, all 4 caucuses worked day and night to be the first to complete their policy initiatives and then rush to the cameras and announce what they were for and beat the other team. Now there's no rush. No, I want to see every single 201 members of the legislature remember that they represent the well-being and the long-term good of their constituents. And the idea that a political party can pull them in for an internal threatening session, I find offensive. And it's not something that any of us should in any way, shape, or form allow to occur. Let me close on this final note. If you look today at the Minnesota stalemate that has occurred, the 2 most important people in that contest are the governor of the state of Minnesota, Mark Dayton, and Tony Sutton. And the big difference is we, the people, elected one of those.
Absolutely right, Arne.
And I would strongly urge Republican legislators to remember who it is that they represent. And once that recognition occurs, then they begin to realize that any proposition involving the governor also involves compromise, and compromise, contrary to the chair of the Republican Party, is not an evil. It's an essential positive ingredient of a democratic society. Thank you.
You know, I keep wondering, how did we make this transition from the state and the nation that Arne was talking about, where we could work out differences, where people got elected with a sense of civility, into the place where we seem to be frozen in our tracks. Every big issue, even small issues, becomes a train wreck. How did this happen? Did you see it coming? What were the clues, the symptoms? And I've got a couple of suggestions. One is, I think, when millions of Americans begin to look at politics in a religious framework, and issues that used to be just fights between politicians over what was the better way to handle things became the issue, as Tony Sutton said the other day, of good versus evil. And I believe once you start thinking that way, everything becomes frozen. You can't talk to your opponent because he represents an evil proposition. And I think that has run through American politics to the point that it's no longer some marginal people around the edges that we used to laugh about, to a solid operating caucus of people that may not have the majority but can hold up a majority from acting. So I think one thing we've got to work on is how do we unfreeze the American and the Minnesota dialogue from this good versus evil into the healthy civic debate that we need. And I think we have to take that head on. The other points have been raised, but I'd like to just add a few additional points if I could. I think that the present system, which developed since one man, one vote, has now permitted the 2 parties, when we redistrict, to use high technology to design districts where the incumbent can't lose. It used to be a closed case. Not anymore. They just sit down, use modern software, and what happens is the two parties just, if the ones that's in power just designs a slam dunk legislature. And in order to do that, they have to pick districts where their side controls everything. And that usually means the activists. So for a politician, it comes down to keeping those activists happy in their district. They don't care about the rest of them. They don't have to care. And we have become, across the nation, a nation that has these self-serving districts where the politicians pick the people and the people don't pick the politicians. A few years ago, the Republicans, Democrats, the California delegation, the largest congressional delegation in the country, got together and decided on a profound principle. And the principle was each of us should have a district where we can be reelected. So they agreed on that generous principle, and sure enough, they were all reelected. And I think that's happening all over the country. We need to break that up, and that's why we propose the independent judicial panel, which is being adopted in several states now. I'd hope Minnesota would be the leader. I hope we get there. And the other is the money thing. The last time I ran for the Senate, I spent $700,000. Now, I don't think you can think of running for the Senate for less than $18 million. I mean, this is, and I'll tell you, you don't get that money from UNICEF and Sunday school. You try to get it any way you can to have enough to carry on the fight. And I think that contributes to the incivility and the paralysis of the system. I once asked George McGovern if he remembered the people who contributed to him. He said, I keep a list of everybody who gave more than $1,000 in my pajamas. And I think this has got our American system paralyzed. It's up for sale. It's being bought. It's the seamy side of the system. And this Citizens United case that holds that corporations can use union treasury money without disclosure and without limit. Is it possible that this government of the people, by the people, for the people, could be broken and bought by more and more money? I'm worried about it.
Maybe if I can just, my colleagues here have really laid it out. I'm ready to go campaigning. I like this. Couple of things, though. You know, government itself, citizens should have a healthy skepticism. There's nothing wrong with that. We need to always ask ourselves, is the government doing the right thing? Are our representatives truly representing us? But that shouldn't turn to a cynicism. And unfortunately today, and it's taken a while, 20 plus years of people moaning and groaning about the government as a troublemaker, as the government being evil. And some people have worked at that. And what has happened is good people that are moderates on both sides have basically said, I've had enough of it. Don't bother me with it. I don't want to get involved. Well, guess who's left? And so in a sense, we do get the government we deserve. And that's why we need to come back and find a way to engage all of us together. Now, the other thing that I would say that's optimistic about this, because I remember my father always ending up with something like this, and he said, just remember what Lincoln said. You can fool all the people some of the time, and you can fool some of the people all the time, but you can't fool all the people all the time. And I see a reawakening, just as early as this past week in special elections. I see people beginning to step up and say, this is going to impact my life, and my kid's life, and my grandkid's life. And all of a sudden, things that were far away are coming closer to them. And so if we re-engage ourselves that way, in the way that I know my father would want to see that happen, then the future is bright. It's going to be full of the sunshine that he always believed in and the optimism that he had. But it will take work. We're going to have to struggle with this. That's what democracy is all about. And so I look forward to it, and I have just enjoyed immensely the wonderful discussion that has taken place here.
I'd like to ask you, Mr. Vice President, there's been a lot of discussion on the Hubert Humphrey legacy over the past several days and the occasion of his birthday. Obviously, in 1948, maybe earlier, Hubert broke through. There was a Democratic Party that was pretty sick before that, Farmer Labor Party that did well at times, but then fell back to third-party status. But Hubert, with great assistance from Orville Freeman and Don and Arvon Fraser, who are here, and you were one of the young Turks at the time, and it didn't result in domination. It resulted in good government, divided government that worked together. Are there any lessons that we can take from that period of time to today? Very different period of time in history, of course, and certainly very different challenges that were facing office holders in those days and candidates. But is there anything we can learn today from those experiences in the 50s and 60s when we really had a sense of unity about politics?
Well, I think the business of politics has changed a lot. You know, our first campaigns, we barely had television. Someone had a fixed phone line, but it was basically community politics, people to people, retail, person to person politics, which I love. Humphrey, secondly, you need people to lead who have special talents. You know, a great doctor, a great businessman, a great musician, politicians that are going to change things need to be people of special and deep skills and talent and devotion. And that's what Hubert was. He was the master. And a professor of mine at law school said, Humphrey's the brightest man I've ever worked with. He could pick up ideas in a hurry. He could read a brief and he'd have it. He could, handle complexity, and he was eloquent, and he was unrelenting. And he took a state that he was almost a perfect example of what would be defeated in Minnesota. But before he got done with Minnesotans, they fell in love with him. And you could see it happening. Take these old farmers, spend some time with them, and they'd get the hands out of their pockets finally and start clapping. And he did that all over the state, and he would lure businessmen over, and he was a genius. And he's the guy, as Orville Freeman said, who really broke the ice in Minnesota. And they were all young, as I mentioned at the lunch today. I think that's part of it. You need people that have got a lifetime and have got that energy and that zip and the tirelessness that is a gift to youth, and get them working. And then you need something in your soul. We wanted to do big things. We could see civil rights, and we wanted to change. This was not a modest issue; it was a big issue. We saw government as a powerful instrument for social justice. We were not ideologues about whether government would work or not. You had to make it work, and you had to be honest about that. But nevertheless, if we were going to accomplish a lot of what we were dreaming about, government had to be a part of the answer. And so we went out and started with nothing, went to communities that weren't receptive, I remember I used to go around, I'd go to a county where we didn't have a single name of a single Democrat. And I had asked for the Knights of Columbus list. And I'd go around and talk to them. I knew there had to be a Democrat in there somewhere. and I found them. And we started putting together a political party. And that's what we did. And I don't, we're not in that condition yet, but I think some of those things that work for us are needed now.
Well, one of the items that you mentioned, this idea that government is the enemy,
Yeah.
which of course is entirely contrary to Hubert Humphrey's life. He believed government could be used as a great force for social good and change. One of the concerns of many is that people see what goes on within government today, and it just really makes the whole situation worse. That they see the squabbling, the lack of civility, and it just feeds into this idea that government is a problem rather than a force for good. And it's one of the areas where trying to get some kind of change is very difficult, because people have this impression that government is bad based on what they're seeing. Skip, do you have thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, Jack, you've described it very accurately. And I think the visibility, the entertainment factor of news these days is very different. I think what people have to understand is, if they're getting into public office, that there's a special relationship that they take on with their representatives. And all too often, I think that some people get into it and they think it's just an 8-hour-a-day job, 5 of which are used to raise money. I remember in our family, you understood it was full-time, and it was going to be, you were on stage in a sense, and some parts of that you didn't always like, but other parts, great privileges that were provided. So I think part of that is a bit of a response to your point. I do want to raise one other thing that I think, and again, I may be wrong on this, but I had a sense during the time that my father was in office, there was in a sense a parameter, a boundaries of the debate that could take place. This country was faced at the time and had the sense that within 15 minutes you could be destroyed totally. Nuclear holocaust. The missiles were aimed, they were ready to go. We didn't have the kind of controls, and we certainly had a powerful Soviet Union and all the rest. And so even though there was this horrendous debate that would take place on various domestic issues, there was this kind of common ground of understanding of the mutual security and safety of the nation as a whole. And so in a sense, it set some boundaries, it seems to me. Now, I may be wrong with that, but I think that part of that was what allowed for the early conversations of the arms reduction. We knew that there was this serious problem. Anybody that lived through that business with the Cuban Missile Crisis, I'll tell you, people were looking around in Washington, where's the basement, and where is the thing that's below the basement that we want to get to? So it had that sense of it too. So the question of civility and balance is, what are the boundaries today? What should the boundaries be tomorrow? And how do I identify those and operate within the framework of those boundaries? I mean, I think we need to challenge ourselves in the future. You take for granted, this democracy has been around for 300 years. 300 years. Take a look at the rest of history. There's a whole lot of autocracies and everything else that have been around for thousands of years. Democracy is a very delicate form of government and governance, and it takes a lot of mutual respect. And we need to be able to instill that somehow in the public, and then we need to ask the public, get involved. Arne said it absolutely right. Take up these issues. Are we just going to talk about it, or are we going to actually get out on the street go door to door, make the difference, organize the counties, do what has to be done, get the job done. I'll never forget, I just got to tell you one story. So I had graduated from law school, passed the bar, happy as could be as a lawyer, had a job, and Lee and I moved out into the burbs, into Plymouth. And it was the time to show our new home and to introduce my father and mother to the neighbors. And so we went around, and of course, Dad was as gregarious as ever. He wanted to meet all the neighbors. Well, I went and shook hands with everybody around there and everything. And we get back. This was before I was in office. And I said, "What you think, Dad?" I'm kind of figuring, okay, what's the deal? Does he like it or doesn't he? And he says, "You have a wonderful home. You have great neighbors. You're right next to an elementary school. Where are the Democrats?" All of a sudden, reality kind of fessed up right there. I mean, on the one hand, he understood all those wonderful things, but he got down to practical reality. You want to be in politics, you better find out who's going to vote for you, and you better know who they are. So I just leave it at that. Civility also comes with engagement in the process. And in the game, if you want to call it a game, it's a great game. It's a wonderful networking. It's a new challenge, though, with our ways of reaching out to people.
We just have a couple minutes left. Governor, do you have any final words of wisdom for us?
I'm not sure that they're words of wisdom, but they are final. But I do want to pick up on comments that both Skip and Walter have made. One is, we live in the age of the computer. And just as it was an awesome transition to television, it's an even more awesome transition to this computerized world of instant messaging, and likewise the communications that now place the political system under 24-hour watch. And we've always joked about never watch the legislature in process, because it's sort of like watching sausage being made, and there's truth to that. It never was a smooth process. But the sad part is, it has gotten increasingly worse. And a large part of the reason is the nominating process. The traditional politeness says, well, the left is skewed to the left, the right is skewed to the right. It's kind of like two bad boys got together and had a fight. You know, that's kind of American. But the reality is that it's not. When you look at the Republican side and you wonder why so many capable candidates have dropped out, and I thought today's cartoon in the Star Tribune depicted it very well, and that is, there is no way a moderate or a traditionally conservative Republican can make it through the nominating process. Look back and ask yourself the question, could Robert Taft, who is the conscience of the conservative movement for decades in the United States Senate and for the United States, could he be a Republican today? And the answer is no. Could Barry Goldwater, clearly Mr. Republican, could he? No. And as a matter of fact, in his declining days, it was known he was not and could not be. Could Dwight Eisenhower, the last Republican to balance the federal budget, could he succeed in today's environment? Probably not. The last piece of irony is Ronald Reagan, who on one hand is the god, or held up as the god of the movement, but his record would make certain that he could not get through the process. Let's suppose his name were John Johnson, and he instituted 11 tax increases, appointed a pro-choice female to the Supreme Court of the United States, strongly opposed Proposition 6 in California, which was an anti-gay proposition sponsored by the Republican Party. Could he be nominated today, or would he be demonized? I would argue he would be open to a lot of demonization. And so what has happened is that not just the moderate wing of the Republican Party, but anybody who disagrees with the agenda that's set forth by people who have never run for dog catcher will be rigidly applied. And so competence is one of the first things to go along with truthfulness. Now, forget about our individual biases. But when you look at the array of candidates that are now before us, can you honestly, truly, as an American, say that they represent our best and our brightest? When you look at the survey by national legislative groups on finances, 2 of the worst financial records go to the states of Alaska and Minnesota, both of whom may have horses in the race. I'm not going to pick up on that one. Now, the question that you may raise is, well, why should we Democrats care? The answer is, why you should care is because you are first Americans. Secondly, none of us today can predict what will transpire a year and a half from now. Thirdly, any person who's on the ballot could be elected. And we in Minnesota have some history on that. And why are they looking at me?
Right on.
But suffice it to say, as Skip has pointed out, if we continue to take our best and our brightest and our most competent and put political theater ahead of political substance, one, we as a nation will not continue to be a first-rate international power. 2, we will not grow those kinds of quality employment opportunities that we like to think are part of our heritage. And thirdly, we will find ourselves being dictated to, rather than, as Walter Mondale has said, being a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. We have a splinter wing in the Republican Party that I believe comes across as wanting to create a theocracy. That is frightening. As a person who minored in religion, I never realized that Jesus was for greed, that Jesus was for the well-to-do and the powerful, and had disdain for those who were sick or impoverished. But what's sad about that is we, the people, have allowed others to define religion, to define their mission in the context of a higher power, blessing that mission, and we do it without proper fight back. We have to learn, as the good senator taught us, we have an obligation to participate, to speak out, to be truthful, and when need be, to throw the rascals out. And frankly, I think the time has come for that.
Excellent.